Each individual landowner, water supplier under an informational order would be required to provide information potentially related but not limited to ownership, water sources or suppliers, surface water right diversions, subsurface water right diversions, priority of right and land patent information, and estimates of water use. The regulation does not require subsurface diverters to measure their diversions. Rather, subsurface diverters would be required to provide an estimate of use. The State Water Board will provide the tools to assist surface and subsurface water diverters in estimating their diversions. In addition, the State Water Board has a dedicated phone line and email address for this emergency regulation, and staff will continue to respond to questions throughout the regulation's duration. State Water Board staff has developed a draft handout that provides an overview of the type of information anticipated in the informational order. The handout also provides information on how someone can obtain the information. The draft handout is available in the back of the room, along with other information related to the proposed emergency regulation. To help landowners and water users determine if their surface or subsurface water diversions are in the affected watersheds or the critical areas, and correspondingly whether they are subject to the informational order and enhanced conservation measures, the State Water Board has developed an online tool that allows water users to find their property on an interactive map. Using the lookup tool, a landowner can determine whether the regulation applies to them, and if the regulation applies, what portions of the regulation are applicable. Users of the mapping tool can enter the addresses of properties into the search box, or can pinpoint individual properties or diversion sources by clicking on the map directly. The tool then tells the users if the selected address or point is in a priority watershed, a critical area, or outside the watersheds that are part of the proposed regulation. This slide provides an overview of how a landowner who has a subsurface water diversion can obtain the well information needed that is anticipated to be part of an informational order that would be required under the regulation. The Department of Water Resources does not charge for this service. And this is a copy of the well completion request form that would be sent to the Department of Water Resources. Requests should be sent to the North Central region of West Sacramento, California, and responses will be sent to the requester. Copies of the form have also been provided as a handout and are located in the back of the room. Subsection 876F is for new diversions, and it is a new diversion is any diversion initiated after an information order goes out for a watershed. Any owner of a new diversion would have to submit the information required by the informational order prior to the commencement of the new diversion. Violation of the regulation are subject to enforcement by the board under Section 1846 of the Water Code and any other applicable authorities. Other state and local authorities may also enforce the regulation to the extent of their authority. In addition, under subsection 876D6, taking any action prohibited by the conservation measures in subsection 876D1 or failing to take the action in subdivision D2 is an infraction, and water use prohibited by the proposed regulation would subject the user to enforcement for both a violation of the regulation under Water Code Section 1846 and a criminal infraction, punishable by administrative civil liability of up to $500 per day and a fine of up to $500 per day, respectively. Under subdivision 876E, each landowner is responsible for immediately providing notice of any informational orders to all water users associated with the parcel. Failure to provide the information requested within 30 days or any additional time extension granted is a violation subject to civil liability of up to $500 per day for each day the violation continues. Under subdivision 876F, diverters from new diversions are subject to civil liability if they do not report the information required by a general order.
So to summarize, violations would be subject to a penalty of up to $500 per day for both the conservation measure and the informational order.
You mentioned that local or other agencies could use these authorities. Do you have any examples of agencies that you have in mind or have approached us about assisting us in enforcement?
So we have been consulting with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife on having a coordinated enforcement approach and working with them so that when they're in the field, if they do see violations, they would be able to document those violations and submit them to the State Water Board.
And also with the conservation measures being an infraction, certainly a city or county could enforce those as well, the same as the board could for a violation of the regulation. This similar language too is in the statewide conservation regulation, declaring those an infraction. But the reference to other local entities was intended to reflect the possibility that under budget trailer bill language, water suppliers would have authority to enforce these rules as well. So those that aren't covered as cities or counties that are suppliers, but other suppliers could also enforce the regulations.
The State Water Board estimates that the total cost to local agencies and governments will be approximately $4.8 million. The costs assumed were the cost to replace ornamental turf, the cost to complete and submit online information for an informational order, and the cost for the Department of Water Resources to respond to requests for well completion information.
Why are you assuming you're going to have to replace ornamental turf? A
So
lot of it goes dormant. It's not that easy to kill. It looks like crap, but it doesn't die. I mean, some might. It depends on what kind of turf you have.
right.
I'm sorry, I'm becoming something of a turf expert.
Right. So for the purposes of the estimate of the fiscal impact, we did a like-for-like replacement. So Dan is going to say that, we don't encourage folks to replace dead lawns with another lawn. We would rather have them replace it with something that's more drought tolerant and native if possible, and they're interested to do so. But in terms of looking at the regulation and its potential impact, we made an assumption and looked at a like-for-like replacement.
Die as a worst-case scenario.
We
when
did.
In fact, it's not necessarily going to die on the kind of grass people have.
Right, depending upon the type of grass that folks put in. And we did make an
Can
assumption.
you be clear on that, though, in whatever written stuff you have? Because the assumption that it's going to die is incorrect. Some will, but
Right.
it depends on how it could rain.
and just
so
on-
it just depends. Every time it rains, they get an injection of something or other that's good. So I'm just uncomfortable with, unless you say this is a worst-case scenario, we're sending mixed message.
Right, this is the most conservative. We will relook at the digest to make sure that we are caveating it in that way.
And another mixed message concern is replacing ornamental turf. Could we also provide, or, a drought-tolerant plants?
So this, just to be clear as to the reason for this particular analysis, is the government code for providing or doing emergency regulatory actions for the Office of Administrative Law. They require you to look at the fiscal impacts to state and local entities, and in doing that, this is separate than the economic impacts analysis that would be undertaken for a formal rulemaking, or the one that was done for the conservation reg, because that was somewhat different, and we did both for that, sort of based on the amount of time we had. But for this, what we did look at was a conservative estimate of what may happen, and certainly not encouraging anybody to replace that. And again, it's conservative because we have to look at the potential fiscal impacts to state and local public entities. And so this is not everybody. This is just the public agencies.
Everybody number would be bigger if you were going on that.
As an economic analysis of the impacts to everybody who would be affected by the regulation, it would certainly be a different number with different assumptions built in. But this one applying to just the agencies, essentially, public entities, there had to be some assumptions. And the easiest, most reasonable assumption would be that there would be a like-for-like replacement if the replacement occurred. This is sort of a ceiling for the assumption.
I'm just suggesting something on messaging. I understand what you
Okay.
need to do, but replacing ornamentals. I mean, this, and I don't know who all is going to be using this, but it does send a message of replacing turf, and we're trying to get people to move in a different direction.
We'll make sure that the digest reflects that this is a very conservative worst case estimate, and that, you know, we encourage everyone to go drought tolerant, et cetera, just to qualify that
Also qualify at its worst case that it will die.
Yes, we'll make sure to add that language to the digest.
Just because you have to meet a requirement, a technical punching the clock, does not mean ignoring all the reality and the rest of the message. I know we've been through this in every context, in every SEQA analysis we've had a conversation about, but really, please, 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 it can be misleading.
Right, and the digest does now contain language that we are not encouraging folks to replace like for like. That language is in there, and Dan was going to say something about that in a moment. But we will also, I do not believe we have language in there that says not all lawns will die, and we will be sure to make sure that that is added in there and that message is out there. And also when we do our Q&As, you know, we can include that information as well.
Certainly this isn't encouraged, but this particular slide is to note one checkbox that has to be noted. So it doesn't reflect any incentive or call for anybody to do this. And like Aaron said, throughout the digest, we do exactly what you're saying, but we will take every opportunity to bolster that and on our frequently asked questions as well. Do you want further discussion of the analysis that went into this, or would you like to move on to the next topic?
State Water Board finds that an emergency exists due to severe drought conditions as identified in the Governor's drought emergency proclamations. Immediate action is needed to prevent the waste and unreasonable use of water in priority water bodies where that water is necessary for threatened and endangered species in light of limited water availability during the drought. The State Water Board needs to require enhanced conservation and additional water user information for the protection of specific fisheries and 4 tributaries, Dutchbill Creek, Green Valley Creek, portions of Mark West Creek, and Mill Creek. The conservation actions are necessary to help provide a minimum amount of water for the summer rearing and late fall through spring migration life history stages of state and federally listed fish. Immediate action is also needed to obtain information on water diversions should curtailments or other measures prove to be necessary to provide sufficient flows for summer rearing or the late fall through spring migration period, or should the current drought fail to end this year. The proposed regulation addresses the emergency and is specifically crafted to address measures that are only needed during this emergency. On this slide is a list of stakeholders that submitted timely comments on item 12. 14 letters were received in total. 10 letters generally support the regulation, while 4 letters opposed it. The State Water Board received 10 letters that were generally in support of the draft regulation. Of these, 4 urged the State Water Board to extend the conservation measures and informational order to other coastal watersheds where Central California Coast coho salmon and Central California Coast steelhead populations are threatened or endangered. State Water Board staff recognizes that there are other tributaries with fishery resources in need of additional in-stream flows. The specific water uses vary by watershed, and measures that may be beneficial in one watershed may not be as effective or applicable in another watershed. State Water Board staff is pursuing this regulation for enhanced conservation measures focused on discretionary, largely non-economic uses of water in these 4 watersheds, as California Department of Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries Service have identified a critical need for listed fishery resources in these watersheds and noted that conservation efforts are necessary and will immediately help fish during the drought conditions. Additionally, 3 letters expressed concern that commercial agriculture uses of water in the tributaries, especially for growing wine grapes, were exempted from the regulation. Commercial agriculture users will be required to comply with the same enhanced conservation measures as other users of water with respect to ornamental turf and landscapes. For example, if a winery has a lawn on its facility, it will be subject to the regulation, and watering of the lawn with anything other than gray water would be prohibited. The State Water Board received 4 letters that were generally opposed to the regulation or a significant portion of the regulation. Of these, 2 provided general comments regarding riparian users taking the brunt of the regulation and that people living in the Russian River watershed are careful water users. The regulation applies equally to all water diversions, surface and subsurface, riparian and appropriative, of water from within the 4 watersheds. Riparian water users do not receive greater focus than other water users, nor should they bear a disproportionate burden. 1 letter requested the removal of subdivisions E and F and stated that the required groundwater information would be difficult and expensive for private well owners to provide in 30 days. As discussed earlier in the presentation, State Water Board staff has and will continue to identify and develop resources to assist landowners with the informational order. Such resources include the Department of Water Resources Well Completion Report Request Form and the draft form that provides an overview of the types of information that would likely be part of an informational order and where that information can be obtained. 1 commenter opposes the adoption of the proposed regulation and the State Water Board's use of the unreasonable use doctrine. This comment is very similar to comments we've received from the commenter on other regulatory efforts, specifically the Mill Deer and Antelope Creek Emergency Regulation and the Informational Order Regulation. There has been no intervening change in law since those were adopted, and comments do not raise issues that the board has not already considered in this and the other proceedings.
Mention the example of how the conservation regulations would affect the agricultural diverters. How about the information order? Does it not also affect the agricultural diverters?
The informational order applies to all landowners and water users within the 4 tributaries equally.
So really the concern in that previous letter centered around conservation measures associated with the agricultural use itself. Okay, thank you.
State Water Board staff updated the text of the proposed regulation in change sheet number 2, which was finalized on June 15, 2015. Some of the key changes include: we removed definitions of diverters and diversions, corrected typographical errors, removed prohibition on new diversions, added requirement to submit informational order data for new diversions prior to commencing diversion, added clarifying language, and updated the numbering of sections. It should also be noted that the change sheet 2 supersedes change sheet 1.
So people don't have to send in their information on new diversions prior to starting new diversions?
No, they do need to send in their information. Yeah, so previously there was no language about new diversions, what would happen during the term of the regulation if someone were to implement or put in a new diversion. Originally there was a prohibition against new diversions, surface or subsurface. That was removed. When that was removed, a new provision was added stating that if you were to put in a new surface or subsurface diversion prior to commencing that diversion, you need to comply with the informational order for that watershed.
Make a comment on this. I asked for that section to be removed. I was concerned about us getting out ahead on SGMA, and I'll be talking about it in a bit, but I think that there are a number of local efforts underway where we could encourage the locals to take an action along those lines.
But SGMA isn't really going to kick in until...
No, I agree. I agree. I'm just looking at, right, they have the authority, as other counties have, taken that sort of action. I think that the main concern is this whole issue of trust and us trying to work in a collaborative fashion. I think that we can get further working with in a collaborative fashion than for us to take a regulatory approach in this area.
So the next steps are...
Just 1 second. This is an interesting conversation. So when do we decide it has worked or it hasn't worked? I mean, is there, like, is this just...
On the issue of new diversions?
Right.
In particular?
Right.
Well, first of all, I don't know how many new diversions are even taking place. I would just question the wisdom of us including it in light of the fact that there may not be many new diversions anyway, and the pushback that we would get locally with the state board stepping in when we have, the legislature has spoken, there's a program, there's a process, and for us to step in when arguably we may not have the authority at this point. So I just think it's a better approach to work collaboratively with some of the groups that are working on this issue, and encourage them to, consider what some of the other counties have done on a moratorium for new wells.
Well, and any new diversion would still have to comply
Come
with
through
the
us.
conservation rules, so it would be like public health and safety law.
So
I guess in order for this to me, it seems that in order for us to be confident that in fact this is working, because collaboration is always the best, we'd need to monthly get a report, maybe through Tom's executive director's report, as to how well it's working. I just want to keep up, because I hate to be a doubting Thomas or a doubting Fran, but I just want to make sure it's working.
Can I just ask for clarification on what you're asking to be reported? Is what you're looking for information on are new diversions, surface and subsurface, within the area affected by the regulation? So while we may get information under the information orders as that new diversion is kicking in, you would like to have a report on the quantity, how many are actually happening during the duration of the emergency reg? Okay.
And I think we have to tie all that information back to outcome. I appreciate you putting the photographs of, a vision of what you and the fishery agencies have in mind. And so, when we talk about whether something's working, that's a community effort, and the outcome will be these connected pools, through the summer at times when naturally they should occur during drought periods.
If I may, Barbara Evoy, Deputy Director for Water Rights. On the issue of new diversions, we have been in communication with the County of Sonoma. All these properties are within Sonoma County, and we've currently provided them our GIS files so they can tell us how many well permits are currently outstanding for the area that might be acted upon. They're 3-year permits. And as well as we've opened up that line of communication. So I think we'll be able to get an idea from the well aspect. Obviously on surface water, that's in our traditional permitting authority for appropriative rights. On riparians, we'll know a little bit more now with the informational order. I think you'll hear from the fishery agencies what their monitoring process is proposed to be during this time period. They are going to be out in the field. They will be giving us reports. So I think they'll be able to respond to that portion directly.